Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very inspiring show coming right up with two very special guests. Our first guest today is Ananda Devi, and she's here to share with us her new book, Intimacy with the Infinite: The Truth About Life After Awakening. Now, Ananda is a powerful, heart-centered Zen-style spiritual teacher. She has transformed the lives of hundreds of students around the world. Born in South Africa, she's a single mother of triplet teenagers. Her spontaneous spiritual awakening in 2014 shattered her conventional materialistic existence, leading her to give up a multi-million-dollar inheritance. Ananda, with her twin flame life partner, deliver the Rasa spiritual blessing via online sessions. She teaches that spiritual awakening is about vulnerability, integration, and love, so that you can become authentic and truly human. So let's welcome to the show, Ananda Devi.
Thank you, Marianne. I'm so excited to be on your show. Thank you for having me.
What a joy it is to have you here. My goodness, once I got your book, I could not put it down. I think it's a journey that a lot of people go through, but they're not quite sure, first of all, how to even verbalize it, and a lot of times what to do with the information.
Tell me about it. It's not easy. That's all I can say. My journey has not been a normal journey, but it has definitely been worth it.
Oh my goodness. Well, for our listeners that are new to you, why don't you share with us what your life was like before you had your awakening?
Um, yeah, that's a great question. I lived a very conventional life. I'm a mom. I have triplets, three 17-year-olds now. And I was married. And when I had my awakening, things just really started to unfold. There was a radical overhaul of what I thought was true, and my life began to shift in ways I never even knew imaginable.
Well, and when you talk about your life before, I know you share a little bit about this in your book where you talk about that you came from where most people would think it's like the family who has everything, because a lot of times people equate financial abundance to, overall wealth. But when we look from a spiritual aspect, a lot of times, while we might be looking like we're doing great on the outside, spiritually we might not quite be there.
Well, yes, exactly. What emerged from it is that I wasn't really free emotionally and psychologically. Now I feel as if I'm a human being, whereas before I had wealth and security in the conventional sense, but I was living a role that I wasn't really being myself at all, but I didn't know it. So the pennies just started to drop one after the other. And it's funny though, I didn't do anything on purpose. It's not like I signed up for it. I just became so totally aware that my life was very phony, and there is a price you have to pay for freedom. At least in my case.
Well, I think that happens for a lot of people. You hear often where people say, if I make X amount of dollars or get that promotion or attain whatever this thing is, then that my life will be peaceful and happy. But a lot of times that spiritual aspect will come and surprise people because you had a spontaneous awakening. It wasn't, like you said, it wasn't anything that you planned.
No, it wasn't anything that I planned. It was so bizarre and so strange and so weird, and I became so incredibly lonely because it was the sense of separation was sucked out of me. And all of a sudden all I wanted to be was genuine, kind of like feeling that I suddenly had or felt an emotional intimacy with my own self and wanted to express that to others. But a lot of people aren't really ready to embody or embrace authenticity or being genuine. And especially in the community, not that there's anything wrong with it. I mean, I really don't feel that people necessarily have a say in the matter. But again, as you were saying, we've become a very logical, rational minded society, and we leave out the emotional body. We leave out what really matters, and that's compassion, love, all those things. The rational mind always stresses the opposite, whereas compassion and love really do go beyond the pairs of opposites. And that's really what awakened within me.
Well, in your book, you call yourself the reluctant mystic. And I think a
Very
lot
much
of people
so.
can relate to that because, when I've had my spiritual awakening and I know other people I've talked to as well, when it happened, a lot of times we're like, okay, am I seeing what I'm seeing? Am I feeling what I'm feeling? Maybe I need a padded room. I'm not quite sure, So,
Yeah, I did sense that a lot, Marianne. I really thought I was going nuts. For a very long while, I suffered immeasurably. I felt very lonely. The best word to describe it is lonely.
so why don't you share with us a little bit of what your spiritual awakening was like?
Well, it was spontaneous, as you said. And what happened was, and I'm going to be brief, all of it is in the book, but when I was a teenager, really, is when strange things began to happen. I just didn't know what the hell they were. For example, something called sleep paralysis, where you're able to stay awake in deep sleep. Now, I was just terrified of that feeling of dropping into sleep and not being asleep. Like I was aware. So I knew at that point that I was in my body and I was in my thoughts. But something else was going on. But instead of like letting it be, I fought it. I just didn't want it to be that way. I felt like I was dying. And it stopped. It stopped happening. I even took a couple of sleeping pills at that time just so I would be knocked out. And years later, when I began seeking, in truth, real seeking, reading the books and listening to satsang and, meeting with teachers, some teachers at least, I then began to meditate. And I talk about that in the book as well. I met a person and I did a TM course. And one thing led to another, and I then had those experiences again. Well, at least one really big experience like that again. And that was the catalyst to knowing my unity with the oneness that they speak of. The oneness that mystics speak of, where you just know I'm not a separate little somebody. There's something much larger going on. So I share an essence with everything and everyone, and that was a very fundamental knowing in me. Even though I can still think like I'm Ananda and I have thoughts and a personality, it's something radical shifted. And a couple of weeks later or months later, I had a kind of a heart opening too. And that was also surreal. And then after that, there was just no going back. I kind of had to release everything that was false about my false self. It just fell apart. It fell apart. Life began to fall apart before it could like rebuild itself up again, And again, my book goes into so much more detail about it, and I think people will enjoy it from that perspective because, again, we all, even a mom, a person like me who's so normal and conventional, who like to go shopping and, all the normal stuff that used to, it can happen. And in fact, it should happen because there's so much more. There's such a deep sense of being and loving and caring that happens when you wake up, and you really don't know until you do wake up. You're asleep until you have an awakening.
So why do you think this experience happened to you?
Oh gosh, I've asked myself that question many times. A large part of the answer is going to have to be I don't really know for certain. But I was a student of something called the Kabbalah, which for many years, and I had done a lot of personal work. This was before my awakening. I had a wonderful teacher. She taught me a lot. And I used what I call in the book the mirror effect. In other words, every time I got emotionally triggered by anybody, I would look at what it is within me that was triggered. For example, if I have judgment, which I did, anything kind of self-loathing, anything that was mine, I owned it all. I didn't cast any blame outside of me for many years. And I think what happened was I prepared my vessel. And I think I can only think. And maybe because I'd emptied out a lot of my concepts and my judgments and my issues, not all of them by any stretch of the imagination, but some of them enough to maybe evoke and invoke that kind of an experience, which was very surreal. I don't know. Maybe my astrology has something to do with it too. I don't know, Marianne, but that's the most I can think of. I think that sometimes.
Yeah, it's interesting because as we go through these spiritual journeys, that's probably a question I think a lot of people ask themselves. It's like, why did I have this spiritual awakening? Or why did that person have it? And that would be something I would like to obtain for myself.
Yes, yes. Well, I think a lot of people think it's a quick fix, an easy fix. In other words, once I awaken, all my problems are going to go away. And I think that's the first concept that has to be dropped, because you're becoming an authentic human being and you're becoming very real, which means that if you had problems before, you're going to have to figure them out now more so than ever, because it's almost as if those parts of yourself that aren't really supposed to be there, they conditioned beliefs many of us hold and all of us have to really be looked at and have to be dissolved somehow. You have to be able to face it. So I think that, that's part of the issue with a lot of people that jump into wanting to just awaken without doing any work, like a quick mystical experience that's going to make you feel like you've transcended. Yes, you can transcend for a while, but it's not going to be everlasting unless you do the work that you need to do. And I think once you begin the work, then an awakening will be something very substantial that can last forever.
Mhm.
It is forever.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when we look at these types of journeys. A lot of times, people who go through spiritual awakenings, it's not easier. They have to actually go through a lot of stuff. And I found that your book was, while being very honest, was also very comforting because I think people, until just recently, when these things would happen, there's no information out there for them to kind of dive into, going, oh, wait a minute, this person's having the same experience or similar experience to me, so there's no comfort.
Yes, well, that's what I was really hoping for by writing my book. I hope just to give people an understanding about what it truly can mean. Now, I don't know if it's the same for everybody. I'm unique and everyone's unique. But in my particular case, and again, I do deal with a lot of students. I do know that it's not always easy. Sometimes we're enmeshed in relationships, families, conditioning. We don't even know how conditioned we really actually are. A lot of it is looking at our beliefs. We have so many conditioned beliefs that we have to really look at. And many of them are negative
Yeah.
and very limiting. So and seeing that it's a belief is sometimes a big one, because we don't really like investigate
Mhm.
what is really going on here. So it's very much living on the surface, whereas as soon as you awaken, you're living in a very deep space,
Mm.
as you know.
Yeah, it's a very, fulfilling, and you talk about this in your book, while it's a difficult journey, it's also a very fulfilling journey. You also share in your book that you were born an empath. And at what age did you really discover that you had those talents and those gifts?
Empath, yes. Not until my 40s. I was, and I had to really look into what was going on, because I recognized suddenly that I wasn't really around other empaths. In other words, empaths have a tendency to feel very strongly. They can feel what is going on in the world. Even you can kind of sense what somebody else is going through, and you really feel for them. And a lot of the times, what happens is you introject. In other words, you take on other people's issues as if they're your own issues to try and help them feel better, and that doesn't really work. Because unless a person really comes to you wanting to change, wanting to wake up, you can't really fix people. Empaths tend to think they can. So I had to really awaken to the fact that it really wasn't my job to fix anybody unless they came to me wanting to be fixed, and that such a small percentage of the population are real empaths. only 1 or 2%. I had no idea. You tend to think that the way you are is the way everybody is, but it's not the case at all. People are generally, kind of selfish. They can be kind of selfish. Empaths are not selfish people. They don't feel as much of a sense of their own self as they feel very entwined with other energies, what's going on around them.
Yeah, it's interesting when people and different souls come in with certain gifts, such as yourself, and how that, really kind of lays the path before them. Do you think that, and there's some belief systems that talk about that we choose the parents that we have because they're really our teachers and they give us a greater understanding of the path we're going to walk. Do you feel that your parents had that similar impact for you?
I've thought about that question too. On some level, definitely, I do believe that we choose everything that goes on some level. And in fact, sometimes it is through these incidences or human beings that really challenge you to in ways that you never thought were, that you don't necessarily think are fair or are just. And they love you as much as they can, but their love is limited if they're incapable of really understanding unconditional love. So in my particular case, I didn't feel I was loved unconditionally. And maybe I always felt I could love unconditionally, but that whole idea was something that I only woke up to, this idea of unconditional love. So I think my parents have been great teachers, sometimes in teaching me who I want to be versus who I was maybe born to be as far as they were concerned. They had certain ideas about how they saw their daughter progressing and that patriarchal kind of way of being raised and not really allowed to be my own person. And, the idea that if I were to inherit money, then I had to, be the person they wanted me to be. But to be my free, true self was something that they didn't like. They didn't like me being this way. I had to face it.
Well, it's interesting. You hear this with a lot of people where their parents tend to try to control them through money or assets or what have you, and if there's inheritance that's involved, and a lot of times walking your own path means leaving that behind.
Yes, in my case, I had to leave all of that behind because it felt like a noose around my neck. Not because they were nasty people, and I love them dearly, I always will, but because there was an underlying sense of basically fit in or dot, dot, dot. And I guess I'm living the or now. No communication and no desire to know me and no interest in my life at all. I didn't sign up for that. It's what they seem to have want. So, I realistically, I've just had to live it the way it comes up. I'm not trying to control an uncontrollable existence.
Well, in your book, you talk about the Enneagram, and I'd love for you to
Yes.
share with us how this has impacted your life and your work.
Oh, the Enneagram is such a wonderful, wonderful ancient wisdom. Some say it was even discovered in Mesopotamia years ago. And many psychologists, such as Carl Jung and Fritz Perls, and who was another one? I forget his name. Anyway, they developed psychological a psychology around the Enneagram. What it really is, it's a system of understanding your fixation, and a fixation is another word for an ego. So they're numbers between 1 and 9, and each person in the whole world has an Enneagram number. And that number is really pointing to the fixation. For example, the Enneagram type 1 is the perfectionist. The type 2 is the helper. The 3 is the performer. The 4 is the romantic. The 5 is the observer. The 6 is the loyalist. The 7 is the joyous. kind of divine child. The 8 is the challenge, and the 9 is the peacemaker. And all that's the fixation. That's basically our ego, how we operate according to a fixation. So the fixation, meaning, for example, the perfectionist, the 1, if you're a perfectionist, your perfection or your need to come across as being a perfect person is both your blessing and your curse. It's a blessing because it's wonderful to be a virtuous, perfect person who strives for perfection, but it's not so wonderful when all you're doing is criticizing yourself and other people around you. So when you start understanding your type, your fixation, you're understanding how you work as an ego. Now, it's not your essence, obviously, because an ego and an essence are 2 different things. Your essence is, I like to think of it as that space within ourselves, which is changeless, is kind of like our nirvana. And then you have this essence, you have this fixation, which is an ego, which kind of is the area that we have to filter our essence through. We need it because otherwise we wouldn't be unique. But at the same time, it isn't who we actually are. So the more awakened you are, the more you're filtering through more of your essence versus this little I, this little person who is fixated on being seen in a certain way. So the Enneagram is just a beautiful way to use it as like self-inquiry, self-observation. You watch yourself being fixated on being the way you are, and you manage to change the things you don't like accordingly. But you have to become aware of those things first.
That's a difficult road.
Yeah.
To look at the shadow and, because a lot of people, they're like, hey, I'm great at all these things, but I got to look at the dark side of what these things also represent, can be a little tough for some people.
Yes. Well, shadow work isn't easy, but a lot of the time the shadow work is not necessary. For example, you can be an Enneagram type 8, what I am. So really what my shadow was my vulnerability. Because as a ego, as a little me, I came across as being very strong, invulnerable, not at all in touch with my vulnerability, my feelings, how I felt. I thought of my feelings as symbolically representing weakness. That if I was a feeling person who actually felt, for example, uncomfortable, sad, any feeling word, that was a sense of being vulnerable that I didn't want the world to see about me. So my vulnerability was hidden in my shadow. And each type has got something hidden in their shadow that they have to really look at. They have to allow it to surface so that they can embody that part of themselves. That's why the Enneagrams it's not as difficult as it sounds. It's actually it's a very real way of coming to terms with the work we each have to do. It's similar work, but it's just different in the sense of, what our fixation is.
Well, do you find that when people use the Enneagram, because I know you work with students all over the world, when they use it, the work that you have set forth with the Enneagram, that they're able to kind of reach a place of spiritual awakening for themselves?
Yes. I believe that they can. Yes, absolutely. If they're willing to do the work in all sincerely and honestly, and the desire is there. You have to have that absolute desire to awaken. If you have that desire, anything's possible, but it's got to be the number one desire. Usually the students that come to me are students that are really what I call ready to finish. They want this. They want to awaken. They want to get past the fixation, and they really are committed to doing their work. My job is to challenge the fixation. In other words, to point out their beliefs when they're having a belief that doesn't necessarily serve them, if they're being completely, truly honest with themselves, if they're trying to come across a certain way versus really, is that really their truth? And also about it not being about concepts and ideas that you get from books. You can kind of read a mystic's words and think that that's what it means, but it has to really be reflective of your own existential now experience. It's not about words. It's about living it. So often what students do is they don't take their own existential experience into account, whereas they really should, because that's what matters. They were the guru. They were the beingness. When they wake up to that notion, then things really begin to shift within them.
Well, and it's interesting, earlier in our discussion, you talked about like the second awakening you had was in the heart. And I'm finding it kind of dovetails nicely with our discussion here. Did you feel that when you had the heart awakening, it helps you to greater see what's going on with your students and just with people in general?
Absolutely, absolutely, because compassion and love go beyond the pairs of opposites. So that kind of love, even though, and I wrote this in the book, there was definitely a time, a oneness, a sense there that was so surreal and impossible for me to maintain. I maintained it for a long time, but I wasn't operational in the usual way. I felt like I was in a love trance, one with everything. And even talking about it, which is something I really do, talking about it even is not very me. I'm a very actually practical person, so it was a massive shock for me. But yes, that love helps me deal with people because again, I feel that my essence and their essence or your essence is really my essence. So when I'm helping another person, I am helping myself, at least a part of myself. That's where you start to really tap into that universal love, the need to share, you
Mhm.
know.
Well, and
So it helped me in a big way.
oh, yeah, I could see where that would be. And to really have a heart awakening, I mean, how profound is that? Because I think a lot of people walk through life not really understanding that they might have their heart closed until they have that really deep awakening that takes place.
Yes, I had a pretty closed heart. I think I must have. I mean, probably a little bit more open than most because I'm empathic. So I was a loving child, a loving person, but that was something surreal. I've never experienced. I mean, that felt like my entire heart chakra blew open. Something happened, and I
Mhm.
haven't really been the same since.
That's a good thing.
Yeah, yes, exactly. I hope so. Yeah, yeah.
Well, we're glad that you had the awakening that you did because it's brought you on this path and you've helped people all over the world obtain their own awakening and travel their own path. What are
Yes.
what's some advice you'd like to give spiritual seekers or people who are out there kind of struggling with these kind of challenges and changes they're going through?
I would say we are living in a time of a mass awakening on our planet. And I would say that just to become as grounded as possible in your own sense of being, really let your experience be the guide and trust that beingness. And if necessary, get a teacher, get somebody who can give you honest feedback. It's so important. And journal. I always say to students, journal what you're going through, journal what you're feeling. And remember that everything's just, I always say this, information is not transformation. So we can read a lot and know a lot, but ultimately doing your work is essential in this time. Really, really, because we can't really change anybody else. We have no control over anybody else, but we can look at ourselves and do our inner transformation. And once that's done, things begin to fall into place. And I really want people to know, everybody to know, that they are perfect just the way they are, really. It's just getting past all our conditioned beliefs about ourselves, which is very much what this is all about. Feeling like I'm not good enough, feeling that expressing myself is not going to be, needed or not going to be, feeling like I have to be like somebody else, following like herd mentality. We're living in times now where it's very much also about an individuality, being unique, telling your story. Why not? It's our life. It's about living.
Mhm. It
Yeah.
it's really profound, when we look at being authentic and walking our spiritual path, and once we start on that path, it feels like nothing else can really well, there's things like, being a parent and a spouse and caring for your community. Nothing else really matters when you're walking this path, it's all about developing spiritually.
It is. But it's amazing, Marianne, because all of it is developing spiritually. Even the ordinary things like being a mother, and I say this to a lot of mothers, it's such a selfless role. when you are constantly putting other people's needs before your own. And so I think what's important is to develop the right consciousness around the things that you're doing. And even your being a wife or being a mother can become your practice. It's a practice in itself. The problem is that there are so many misconceptions about how it's supposed to look. But if it's happening, then it means that the way it's happening is the way it's supposed to be for you. And it's so different for everyone. And I always say to people, you can't really get this wrong. You just have to embrace it being what it is and live it, and really develop the right consciousness around it, not a robotic consciousness. Most people are behaving like robots. They just not really, in there now, in their moments. So a lot of that is about awakening to what's going on with you right now.
Mm-hmm. How true that is. Well, why don't you share with us about, because I know you have students all over the world, what are your programs like and how can people get in touch with you to learn more about the work that you do?
Oh, thanks, Marianne. We have a website, and firstly, I am partnered with my a life partner who's amazing, and his name is Ramaji. And we have a website called rasatransmissioninternational.com. And whenever anybody goes to that website, they can read about everything that we do and everything that we offer, and they can book sessions with us if they so choose. Both of us do the same thing, and we even train other people to do the same work as us, because I'm very much about, and so is my life partner, about really getting more and more spiritual. And I'm saying the word teacher, but I don't really mean it as in teacher. No one needs a teacher, but maybe a feedback person. I don't even know. I use the word teacher because I don't know, I'm a friend, spiritual friend maybe. But so I train people to really do this work as well. Once they awaken, I believe that everybody is really capable and able to help other people get it. If I can do this, so can anyone. Well, that's my theory.
Well, and your book is a great roadmap to help people get to this place where they have a spiritual, kind of understanding. They have a roadmap for their awakening. You talked about the different things that you have. If they're looking to book a session with you, what does that look like as well?
Well, what happens is our sessions. Usually, what happens is a person books a session for like an hour and a half to 2 hours. That's usually the first session. And what we do then is we really sit with the student, and it's all about them. We listen at what experiences have they had, what are they going through, where are they at. What I do then is we allocate what we call a level of consciousness, which is really based on my life partner's um, model, kind of his ladder of consciousness. And it's a number which sounds ridiculous, but I know, but that the number is really indicative of clarity. And there is a part of my book where I talk about a level of consciousness. How clear are you about your essence? Versus your conditioning and your beliefs and who you think you are. So that number really helps us evaluate where the person's at. And then what happens is usually every 2 to 3 weeks, the person comes back for what we call our mini sessions, book 2 at a time. And every 2 to 3 weeks, they have another session. And what we find is their LOC steadily starts to rise. In other words, they're becoming more and more clear. They're starting to really look at their stuff, dissolve their stuff. I work with the Enneagram. I work with anything that's going on with them. And eventually they reach what we call LOC 1000, which is another word for enlightenment, but I don't like that word enlightenment. It's very loaded with an idea. I like awakened, and awakened, they become awakened. They get it. They wake up. And it's pretty incredible when that happens.
What a beautiful place to be. And they can also find your book on your website as well. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. Yes, there's a link to the Amazon .com wherever. Yes, it's on Amazon, and it's there. It's in the store area of our website.
Oh, that is so awesome.
Yes.
Ananda, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Oh, Marianne, it's such an honor and a privilege, and thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you, Ananda. It's been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about your new book, Intimacy with the Infinite: The Truth About Life After Awakening. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You're listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Sunday, Monday, Thursday, and Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern and 5 p.m. Pacific Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.